Dr. Schustoff, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay, are you ready to begin? All right. So prior to the break, the court was asking you about the latency of difference of Hep C to NHL and exposure to a chemical to NHL. Do you remember those questions?
I do remember.
Okay. And do you recall when Mr. Hardiman was diagnosed with hepatitis C?
I don't remember exact time when he was diagnosed, and I think it's really hard to pinpoint actually when he contracted that. But I don't recall off the top of my head, but the first diagnosis was the first test on positive. I do remember that he received a year-long treatment with interferon, and he finished, I believe, about 8 years prior to the lymphoma diagnosis.
We're having a problem. The sound is cutting in and out, Dr. Schustoff, and so we can't decipher what you're saying. I don't know if there's anybody on your end who can do anything about it, or if it's just the connection. But I'll ask you to repeat the answer you gave on whether you knew when Mr. Hardiman contracted or was diagnosed with hepatitis.
Yes, so I don't remember off the top of my head when the first time his test for hepatitis turned positive. But as far as when he contracted that, I think anybody would be making a very violent hypothetical guess when exactly the virus entered his body prior to actual diagnosis. I do recall that when he enlisted into the U.S. military, he did not have any positive tests at that time. And so I cannot tell you the exact date on either of those questions.
Okay, in your deposition, I believe you testified that he was diagnosed in 2005. Does that sound familiar?
Does it matter at this point? It is what it is. Does it matter for purposes of trying to get his opinion excluded?
Okay, we can move on. All right, so let's talk about the hepatitis B. Going back to your expert report for Mr. Hardiman, do you still have that in front of you?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and I believe that when we were looking at page 5 of your differential diagnosis, we're on paragraph 6 where you talk about hepatitis B as a risk factor.
That is correct.
Okay, so why don't you tell the court why you ruled hepatitis B in and how you ruled hepatitis B out as a substantial cause of Mr. Hardiman's NHL.
So hepatitis B, as a general cause, has been linked to the development of lymphomas with not as strong of evidence as hepatitis C. So I felt it is discuss hepatitis B as a possible cause of Mr. Hardiman lymphoma. And the reason I stated again that hepatitis B was highly likely to be cause of his lymphoma. One of them is the same as the one discussed for hepatitis C. In order for any viral agent to be strongly linked to development of particular cancer or lymphoma, in this case, from known cases of strong association, we have to see the evidence of infection at the time of lymphoma diagnosis or lymphoma relapse. Now, when it comes to hepatitis B in Mr. Hardiman's case, we do not have even evidence that he had hepatitis B infection or was active infection. What we have is a test that he has developed immunity to one of the hepatitis B proteins, which means in medical
right. So just to be clear, your opinion is that at one point, Mr. Hardiman was exposed to the hepatitis B virus, but there's no evidence that he actually had the hepatitis B infection.
That is correct. So clinically, I've never seen evidence of hepatitis B replication in his bloodstream or in his body, or any signs of actual virus presence in his blood, serum, or in his body. So all we can say by test that indicates his exposure is that he had an encounter with hepatitis B virus, and his immune system developed a response against hepatitis B.
Okay, and can you explain the significance of inactive or dormant hepatitis B virus?
For the purpose of, again, risk factor of lymphoma, the strongest association has been demonstrated for cases of patients where there's a persistence of virus DNA or a viral particle in the subjects who develop lymphoma. And in patients where we determined that they are positive for immune system encounter with hepatitis B, all that means that at some point in the past, the hepatitis B has entered Mr. Hardiman's body, his immune system reacted to it, and for any practical purposes, it either keeps it absolutely dormant or inactive, or has eliminated virus altogether.
Okay, now were you able to, based on everything you just said, were you able to rule out both hepatitis B and hepatitis C as the sole cause of Mr. Hardiman's NHL?
Well, it is my opinion, and it is my conclusion that based on the way that viruses cause transformation into cancer, and what I found in medical records in Mr. Hardiman, which I stated specifically, the lack of virus in their system for many years prior to lymphoma diagnosis, I find it highly unlikely that either of those viruses contributed to his development of lymphoma in 2014.
Okay. Now, has IARC classified hepatitis B or hepatitis C as a known carcinogen?
Yes, and I do not dispute the general causation of hepatitis as when it comes to lymphomas. My conclusion pertains specifically to Mr. Hardiman's case, based on my review of his medical history.
Okay, and did IARC's classification have to do with chronic hepatitis C or just hepatitis C?
Their conclusion is based on the literature that showed association between chronic hepatitis C infection and chronic hepatitis B infection and development of lymphoma. And as I stated before, for somebody who spent over decades studying and treating lymphomas, the viral etiology of viral causes of lymphomas require the presence of the virus and elimination of the virus at the time of diagnosis and cure of lymphoma specifically for those proven cases.
All right, so let's turn to page 9 of your report. You have two conclusions there, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to ask that you read them into the record, but if you could just read them to yourself real quickly. Are those your opinions?
That is correct.
And do you hold those opinions to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
That is correct.
All right, let's turn to Mr. Gabayu. If you could put aside Mr. Hardiman's expert report and bring up Mr. Gabayu's, please. I think it's Exhibit 2. Okay, turn to page 5, please, of your report.
Yeah.
Okay, and the section that says analysis, I've got up the wrong report myself. Hang on one second. All right, so the section that says analysis of Mr. Gabayu's risks for developing DLBCL, this is your differential diagnosis, right?
That is correct.
All right, and so if you could just run really quickly through factors 1, 2, 3, and 4 and 5, and then stop when you get to hepatitis B.
Well, I don't think he needs to repeat the conclusions that he wrote down. I've read them.
Okay.
So why don't you just get straight to, I understand.
Hepatitis B, okay.
Why don't you get straight to the point?
Okay. So we'll go straight to hepatitis B, and could you explain how you rule, or you've already explained why you ruled in hepatitis B with respect to Mr. Hardiman. Is that the same reason why you ruled in hepatitis B with respect to Mr. Gabayu?
Pretty much. Again, the literature on hepatitis B, which is not as strong as hepatitis C, specifically finds association or suspected association of patients with chronic hepatitis B infection, which means that evidence of persistence of viral particles in those patients or those subjects or persistence of hepatitis B DNA. In subjects where there is absence of the virus, the association is much less reliable or not determined.
Okay. And so can you tell the court why you were able to rule out hepatitis B specifically for Mr. Gabayu?
In Mr. Gabayu's case, once again, the strongest fact that I found in his medical history as far as his exposure to hepatitis is the encounter of his immune system with hepatitis B agent and development of something called anti-4 antibody or immune response against the virus. More so, I would again emphasize that Mr. Gabayu received identical treatment for his lymphoma, where he was exposed to a very immunosuppressive regimen, in which case other evidence of hepatitis B infection would be the resurgence of the virus, and we did not see that. So the same principles that I used, or explanation I used for Mr. Hardiman's case, would apply to the case of Mr. Gabayu's. In order for me to suspect the strong possibility of hepatitis B virus contributing to his lymphoma, I would have to see chronic persistence of the viral particles in his blood or serum, or persistence of hepatitis B DNA. And just going back to the court's question, goes back to the mechanism how viruses transform cells to lymphoma. They have to continuously operate so that the cells that they infect become cancerous. And it is nonsensical pertaining to that mechanism that viruses infected the cell, transformed into lymphoma, and exited without any trace that they were ever there. So it's a different mechanism from basic chemicals like glyphosate or others causing DNA damage.
Okay. So Meniere disorder, did I pronounce that correctly?
Meniere's, yes.
Meniere's disorder. Can you please tell the court and me what that is?
So Meniere's disease, we call it, is it's a disease of acoustic nerve that is believed to be autoimmune in nature, that affects the nerve responsible for us being to interpret acoustic signals. So when patients come with a complaint of ringing or hearing impairment, we, in general, in internal medicine, try to identify the causes of such impairment. And most common sort of problems would be
Okay. Did Mr. Gabayu was he diagnosed with Meniere's disease?
In his medical records, he saw I believe, specialist, a neurologist, who suspected that it was Meniere's disease to explain his symptoms.
So was there any evidence that he was actually diagnosed with Meniere's disease that you saw or can remember?
Well, there's no specific test for Meniere's disease. As I mentioned, it is a diagnosis of exclusion.
Okay.
So there's no blood test, there's no CT scans, there's no biopsy that can prove it. And that's what diagnosis of exclusion means. So after a neurologist excluded any other explanation, he's left with possibility of Meniere's diagnosis.
All right. And is Meniere's diagnosis a risk factor for NHL?
No, not to the knowledge, but to current knowledge.
Okay. So let's turn to your opinions on page 8 of that report, of your report. And if you could just read your opinions really quick to yourself. And are those your opinions with respect to Mr. Gabayu?
Yes.
And do you hold those opinions to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes.
All right. If you could put Mr. Gabayu's report to the side, please, and turn to the final report, which is for Mrs. Stevick. Okay. If you could turn to page 5 of your report. And similar to your, excuse me?
I have it.
Okay. Similar to your other reports, you have a section called Analysis of Ms. Stevick's Risks for Developing DLBCL. And we talked about earlier how she has a DLBCL in the brain that is a certain different subtype, right? Okay, and so this section that starts on 5 and ends on 6 is your differential diagnosis, correct?
That's correct.
All right, and so we have we're not going to go through 1, 2, or 3 as we've discussed those, and 4 as we've discussed those earlier. What I see not included in this report is a discussion of her radiation exposure, which was discussed at your deposition. Do you remember that discussion?
I do.
Okay, so why don't you tell me why the radiation exposure is not included in your report and what sort of consideration you gave it in your opinions?
So when we ask patients about exposure to prior ionizing radiation, I always clarify, and I hope my colleagues always clarify. So what it means is we ask them about substantial exposure to the doses and amounts of radiation that are considered to be risk factor to developing not only lymphoma, but any other cancer. So I personally always specify for the static what I mean by that. And I give examples of somebody receiving radiation treatment for other cancers in the past, whether she or other person has been employed by nuclear power plant for many years, whether in the military person was stationed on nuclear submarine or worked somewhere in a facility involved in production of radioactive chemicals for research or other purposes. So those would be considered a substantial exposure to radiation sufficient enough to consider it as a risk of cancer, or in this case, lymphoma.
Let me just interrupt. Let me interrupt for a second, just for the benefit of the court reporter. This is very challenging for the court reporter because the sound keeps cutting in and out. What I will say is that, don't worry about it. If you can't, take something down, just mark it inaudible. It's not a big deal. It's just a Daubert hearing. If it is something that seems particularly important, I will make sure, or Ms. Wagstaff or the other lawyers will make sure to jump in and make sure it's repeated. But for the most part, it's not important enough to require the witness to repeat himself. I get the gist of it. Go ahead.
Good, because you could see her face like. don't remember where we actually were. So
you were actually, Doctor, I actually interrupted you. You were going to add something. But if you don't recall,
so when I asked Ms. Static those specific questions in the example, and mentioned exposure to radiation treatment of other cancers, exposure to radiation while working in a nuclear power plant, or serving a nuclear submarine, or involved in a industrial production of radioactive chemicals for industry or research, those are examples of substantial exposure that she denied, that she did not have such an exposure in the past. And that's why I stated that she did not have exposure to radiation in my report.
all right, and so just to be clear, when you were doing your in-person examination of Ms. Stevick, you asked her about her radiation exposure, and she testified that she had none. Is that what you just said?
That is correct, and I will repeat that. I asked her specifically the exposure to radiation that would match those examples that I gave her.
Okay, and since that time, you have learned that, in fact, Ms. Stevick had minimal exposure to radiation through her 30 years as a speech pathologist, where she was present for approximately 15 swallow tests over 30 years of a patient in the same room. Do you remember learning that since your deposition?
I remember it came up in the deposition, yes.
Okay, and is that level of radiation exposure anything that would change your opinion in Ms. Stevick's case?
No, that exposure to radiation, it is in the opinion of any oncologist or a lymphoma specialist, for that matter, would be negligible. And just to give you an example, that exposure to one test like she received, one of those tests would be equivalent of just one plane flight from one coast to another. So the amount of radiation that we consider harmful to DNA or cause DNA damage sufficient to develop cancer exceeds that exposure by a factor of thousands. So one would have to have thousands X-rays or CT scans for somebody to say, well, your exposure was sufficient to consider X-rays or CT scans the risk factor for the lymphoma.
Okay.
Another point to that would be that we do not even keep a track of how many CT scans patient had, even when we treat their cancer, because the chances of us exceeding a threshold we reported about it is next to zero.
Okay, so your original methodology included questions about radiation, and then you got updated information, which you now are factoring in. And it's your opinion today that the radiation exposure of Ms. Stevick is not a substantial contributing factor to her NHL. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And then if you look at the last paragraph in your differential diagnosis, which is paragraph 5, you talk about Ms. Stevick's Roundup exposure. You say his use, but I'm sure that's just a typo, her use. And you talk about how her use of Roundup was both intensive, large quantities, and with no barrier to prevent absorption, inhalation, and prolonged, roughly 25 years. Is that how you remember Ms. Stevick's Roundup exposure?
That's correct.
Okay. And we skipped over that paragraph in Mr. Gabayu's report, but you remember Mr. Gabayu having significant Roundup exposure as well?
Yes, I do.
Okay. If you turn to your conclusions on page 8, if you could read those conclusions in Ms. Stevick's report.
Yes, I read those.
All right, are those your conclusions with respect to Ms. Stevick?
Yes.
All right, and do you hold those opinions to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
I do.
All right, does the court have any questions?
Not right now.
Okay, pass the witness. I'll reserve time for redirect.
Okay. Before we get to cross-examination, just a couple quick things that popped into my mind that I want to say before I forget. One is with regard to the evidentiary issues that we were discussing this morning. What I would like to request of the parties, you all are filing your motions in limine like on Wednesday or something? Is that right?
Yeah, that's Wednesday.
What I would like to request is that you, I'm looking ahead to trial, and I'm going to have my list of motion in limine rulings, and want to keep track of those during trial. And so I'm thinking about how we label the issues that have already been teed up compared to the issues that you're going to tee up on Wednesday. So maybe the best thing, how were you planning on labeling it? Was it like plaintiff's motion in limine number 1, defendant's motion?
We hadn't talked about it, but I mean, we've already exchanged responses and everything. I mean, they are
right. Well, what I would like you to do is either, start at number 7, because we have 6 issues that are already teed up, or start at plaintiff's motion in limine number 4 and defendant's motion in limine number 4. Frankly, for me, it might be a little bit easier to just say number 7, number 8, number 9, 10, on down, because there's often overlap between, something that the defendant does and something the plaintiff does. I don't care that strongly about that, but I just want you to take the numbering, take into account the fact that we effectively already have 6 motions in limine on tap. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Also, are you going to have oral argument on those, or are we
on what?
The other remaining 25 or however many motions in limine?
To the extent necessary, yeah, we'll
Okay.
talk about it at the pretrial conference.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's what I was.
And then the other thing I wanted to flag for you all, we don't have to talk about it now, but thinking about like the best use of everybody's time, I'm wondering if it would have been better to go straight to cross-examination with Dr. Schustoff, and I'm wondering if it will be better to go straight to cross-examination with the other. There are 2 more witnesses, right? And Dr. Weisenberger is both general and specific, but we're only cross-examining him on specific, right? And the other witness is also specific causation? The bond, right? Okay. So I'm pretty strongly inclined towards just going straight towards cross-examination, because I think what we did now in an hour plus could have been done in like 10 minutes, and so to save everybody time, I think that might be the way to go with the next 2 witnesses. Okay? Let's go ahead and just plan on doing it that way with the next 2 witnesses.
Good afternoon, Mr. Schustoff. I wanted to start by talking about the copying of the report from Dr. Navin. You testified that you received a report in an unrelated case from counsel that Dr. Navin had drafted. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you reviewed the portion that touched on lymphoma generally and agreed with all of the opinions that he offered, and so you copied them into the 3 reports here, correct?
That is correct.
Now, you should have a binder of exhibits in front of you, and I'll try to pull them up here on the screen, but I'll tell you which tab to look at, Dr. Schustoff. Okay, if you can turn to tab 11. If your Honor wants a copy, I have copies. Okay.
2 copies for us, if you don't mind. 3 copies? 3 copies. Yeah, and hurry or it'll be 4. Okay, 5 copies.
We even have 4.
3 is fine. Thank you.
And Dr. Schustoff, do you have a copy of the binder in front of you?
I do. You said number 11, tab number 11?
Sure. So, I first want to show you tab number 11. And this is an email dated, I'll mark this as Exhibit 5. This is an email dated December 19th, 2018, from plaintiff's counsel to a series of lawyers, including myself. Do you see that?
I do.
And it reads, Aaron, the report we discussed is attached. I have redacted the personal information about the client in the report. I can confirm that the client is not one of the three in the MDL. I can confirm that this email was sent to Dr. Schustoff on November 2nd, 2018. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay, and then if we turn to tab 8, and I'll mark this as Exhibit 6. Do you see that this is a redacted report from Dr. Nabhan? Exhibit 5 is the email, and then Exhibit 6 is this report. Do you see tab 8? Do you see the report, Dr. Schustoff?
I do.
And this is the report that you received from plaintiff's counsel before you prepared your 3 reports here. Is that right?
Well, it's been over a month and a half or 1 month. I received the report. It might have been this one. I can't just say this was the report, especially.
And Dr. Schustoff, let me just interrupt and say, if you hear an objection from counsel, it's kind of difficult because of the time delay. But if you hear defense counsel, Monsanto's counsel asking you a question, and then you hear plaintiff's counsel objecting, try to pause before you answer and wait for a ruling from me.
Yes, Your Honor.
And Dr. Schustoff, you can see toward the back of the report, there's a series of paragraphs that are highlighted on the last 3 pages. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And without reading every word, that's the material that you reviewed and then copied into your 3 reports here. Is that right?
It looks very familiar. It probably is, yeah.
Okay, so now let's turn to tab 7, please. And we'll mark this as Exhibit 7. And this is your report in Ms. Stevick's case, correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay, and so then if you turn to page 6 of the report, we have highlighted the language that appeared in the last exhibit we looked at that is verbatim or substantially verbatim to Dr. Nabhan's report. Does that look correct to you?
It looks correct.
Okay. And in fact, you'll recall from your deposition that you made a mistake and copied over something from Dr. Nabhan's report that was incorrect. Is that right?
I do recall that, yes.
Okay, so if we look at your first paragraph on page 6 under discussion of Ms. Stevick lymphoma causation, about 2/3 down, you wrote, this meta-analysis found an association between glyphosate and development of B-cell lymphoma with an OR 2.0, 95% confidence interval, 1.1 to 3.6. And there was the same odds ratio for DLBCL subtype, right?
I see that.
And you recall having gone back and looked at this paper, which is the paper titled Shanasi and Leon, that there was no odds ratio for DLBCL, right?
Yeah, we identified that at the position. I recall that.
So Dr. Nabhan made a mistake, and then you copied that same mistake without verifying the fact that it was incorrect, right?
I was verifying Dr. Nabhan's report, and I missed that.
Okay. And now you're certain that you did not receive a report from Dr. Nabhan in Mr. Hardiman's case, Mr. Gabayu's case, or Ms. Stevick's case prior to drafting your report, right?
To the best of my certainty.
Sorry, could you repeat that, Dr. Schustoff?
To the best of my recollection, yes.
Right, you made that very clear when Ms. Wagstaff was questioning you, that for your specific causation opinions, you did that independent of any materials from any other expert, right?
That is correct.
Okay, so I would like you to look at tab 10. And we'll mark this as Exhibit 8. And this is Dr. Nabhan's report in Ms. Stevick's case, correct?
Yes, it is.
And you see that we have highlighted portions of that report as well, right?
I see that.
Okay, and I'd like you to look at the bottom of page 1 specifically, where it talks about there are 3 bullets that Dr. Nabhan drafted that starts PCNSL is a rare form of NHL that represents 4% of brain tumors. Do you see that?
I see that.
And that discussion then goes on the following page to talk about Ms. Stevick and her overall risk of developing that type of NHL, correct?
I see that.
And that is specific to Ms. Stevick. You agree with that, right?
Discussion is specific to her lymphoma, yes.
Okay, so now let's look back at your report, but let's look at tab 9. And I'll mark this as Exhibit 9. This, again, is your report that you drafted in Ms. Stevick's case, correct?
Yes, it is.
And on page 2, you walk through part of Ms. Stevick's medical history, correct?
That's correct.
And feel free, if you want, to take your time to look at tab 10, but everything we've highlighted is verbatim or substantially verbatim from Dr. Nabhan's report, right?
It looks very similar to Dr. Navin report.
Okay, and then I'd like you to turn to page 5 in your report, paragraph 6. Tell me when you're there.
I'm here.
And that paragraph starts, PCNSL is a rare form of NHL that represents 4% of brain tumors, correct?
Yes.
And that paragraph is extremely similar to the 3 bullets that we just looked at in Dr. Nabhan's report, correct?
It appears to be very similar, yes.
And that's also that paragraph 6 on page 5 of your report is also specific to Ms. Stevick. It's part of your specific causation discussion, right?
It's a discussion of primary CNS lymphomas, yes.
I mean, in fact, Ms. Stevick's name appears halfway down the paragraph and in the third to last sentence line as well, correct?
That is correct.
And so, in fact, it must be the case, Dr. Schustoff, that you also received a Stevick-specific report from plaintiff's counsel that Dr. Nabhan drafted that you then used to draft this paragraph, right?
I don't recall that, honestly.
So you're telling the court that it's just chance that the words match up like this?
In a rare lymphomas like this, I think there's only so many ways you can describe it, but I honestly don't recall receiving this Stevick report before I wrote mine.
But I want to be clear, Dr. Shustov, you drafted every word of your reports, right?
I authored all of my reports.
And you think this is just a coincidence, the similarities between your Stevic report and Dr. Navhan's Stevic report?
I do not remember receiving Stevic's report prior to drafting.
All right, I'd like to switch gears, Dr. Shustov, and talk to you a little bit about DLBCL. You would agree that for most patients, the cause of his or her DLBCL is unknown, correct?
I would agree that the causes of DLBCL is unknown because we never actually look for causes, not because they're unknown in a majority of patients. In general practice, we do not spend too much time in trying to identify patients' causes because our goal in everyday activities try to cure and help patients with DLBCL. So they're unknown because we do not put rigorous effort to identify causes in every particular patient. It is my opinion that if we spend enough time looking at every single patient diagnosed with DLBCL, we would identify several or one or what have you risk factors, just like we identified in these plaintiffs, because we specifically focused on that.
Well, you agree that a risk factor is not necessarily a cause in an individual patient, right?
If it's a risk factor for every individual patient, then it is, in my opinion, more likely this factor contributed to cause the lymphoma. Unfortunately, we do not have a specific test to prove it for most of the factors, like radiation or exposure to chemicals, because they're gone by the time we diagnose the lymphoma.
Well, you agree there's a difference between a risk factor and a cause in an individual patient, right?
Well, the risk factor for individual patient, in my opinion, is more likely to be the cause of this patient's lymphoma than it is not, just because it is a risk factor and it puts people at risk for lymphoma. Can I prove it by doing a biopsy on this patient? It's nearly impossible to do. So we reserve back to identifying the risk factors and stating with a certain degree of certainty that that factor more likely not contributed to this patient's lymphoma. So if you, or the patient came to me and said that I had 40 gray of radiation 5 years ago, and now the patient has lymphoma, can I prove that the radiation caused this patient's lymphoma? So there is nothing to test that will tell me that radiation caused lymphoma, but I will say that it is likely that radiation was a positive factor to develop lymphoma.
So it's your opinion that if a patient has a risk factor for NHL, it is automatically the most likely cause of his or her NHL. Correct?
No, that's not what I said. It's not the most likely factor. It's one of the contributing factors, substantial contributing factors. It's the most likely factor. I can't say with certainty next day.
But it's more likely than not if a patient has a risk factor. You would say in any individual patient, regardless of the risk factor, that more likely than not, that risk factor is automatically a substantial contributing factor to his or her NHL.
I would say that, yes. That's why we identify risk factors to at least have a surrogate to a particular causing factor in every individual patient. That's the reason we look at risk factors.
Now, you said, when you testified on direct, you testified that what you're doing here is what you do in your clinical practice, right?
Well, what I said was that the methods that I used and the way I examined, evaluated the patient was the same as I use in everyday practice. I obviously do not spend as much time and effort identifying causes of lymphomas in everyday practice because my job is to treat patients with lymphoma and not spend a significant amount of looking at causes.
Right, I think you just told us when I was asking you, you actually don't spend time looking at causes, right?
Not as much much time as I spent on this case because I was asked to specifically do that. But as I stated before, in every patient that I encounter, I collect social history, which is a survey of whether or not every patient that I encounter had risk factors in their previous life that could have been contributing to their cancer. That's our standard practice, and it's a good practice, if you will, for caring for patients with cancer.
But you agree, Dr. Shustov, that in your clinical practice, you have never once told a patient that his or her NHL was caused by Roundup or glyphosate, correct?
Specifically Roundup, glyphosate, no.
Now, well, first of all, the estimate, understanding your explanation for why some cancers are idiopathic, the estimate for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is that 80 to 90% are idiopathic, right?
Well, once again, we go back to the same statement. In my opinion, the reason they're idiopathic, we do not spend enough time to look at the risk factors that those patients have, because majority of the patients will be diagnosed in the community by a practicing physician. And even academic practice, most of our activities spend treating patients. And the reason we benefit to idiopathic is because we do not have either time, resources, or focus on examining in depth every particular patient's history. And then we say, well, if I screen for usual questions of radiation, exposure to toxic chemicals, nothing is identified, I say, well, this is the cause is unknown or it is idiopathic.
Some lymphomas have clearly identifiable causes like viral agents, right?
Very few exceptional cases, yes, we were able to identify specific link between viral agent or bacteria to a very specific type of lymphoma.
Right. So the answer was yes, right? Some lymphomas have clearly identifiable causes like viral agents, right?
Very, very few lymphomas do.
Okay. And some lymphomas also, you are able to identify a specific mutation in the tumor itself, correct?
That is correct.
And in fact, you can identify the virus hepatitis C in a tumor if you run certain pathological tests, right?
You would be able to.
And that, we're going to talk about Mr. Hardiman, but that test was just not run at the time on his tumor, correct?
We do not run this test on tumors as standard medical practice.
Now, to be clear, there are no specific mutations that you as a doctor can identify that indicate the cause of a patient's DLBCL was Roundup or glyphosate, right?
Well, none of the mutations in general would tell us what caused the lymphoma. So the mutations are a consequence of the factor that contributed or caused the lymphoma. And then mutation is a facilitator of the process of transformation from normal cell to the cancerous cell. So mutations themselves are their own way of looking for causes of lymphoma.
But you can't identify any specific mutations in someone's cancer associated with Roundup or glyphosate, right?
There's no specific mutation, to my knowledge, was linked to any causative agent. So we have a list of mutations to look at in every lymphoma diagnosis, but we've been looking at them as indicator what caused the lymphoma or where the lymphoma came from.
Well, Dr. Shustov, isn't it true, first of all three plaintiffs here had diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, right? And isn't it true that with diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, except for a very few cases where you can identify specific mutations, you cannot identify the cause?
In every particular patient as a specific cause of the lymphoma, it is very hard to identify. For a majority of patients, we cannot run any test or we don't have any test to indicate where lymphoma came from. But again, if we identify the risk
Dr. Schustoff, I would like you to look at, we have your prior testimony, and so that should be in a binder as well. And if the court would like that, I can either pull it up on the screen or hand up a binder. I'm not sure you have this testimony because it's actually from the Wendell case, so it's from a different case.
Why don't you pass it up? I don't like relying just on the excerpts that the lawyers have put together.
Dr. Schustoff, you are an expert in a case called Wendell versus GSK, correct?
That is correct.
And if you turn to tab 4 of this binder, that has your testimony in that case. Do you see that?
Just give me a second.
Page 20.
Page 20 of the tab 4.
Yes, are you with me, Dr. Schustoff?
I am. I'm looking for page 20 of under tab 4.
Okay, and I'm going to talk to you more about Wendell in a moment, but at line 3, you were asked, okay, and can you give us a couple examples of lymphomas that are de novo or very rarely have a known cause? And your answer was, there's a majority of lymphomas. Diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, and you list a couple of others. Those lymphomas we don't know the causes of except for a very few cases where we identify specific mutations. Do you see that?
It is on page 20. I'm sorry, I did not find it yet.
Okay, tab 4, Dr. Schustoff, page 20, lines 3 through 9.
Okay, I'm here.
Okay, and so go ahead and read that question and answer, lines 3 through 9, and just tell me if that's what you testified to in a case where you were asked to give examples of lymphomas that are de novo or very rarely have a known cause.
Okay, I read it.
Okay, and you volunteered diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, right?
That is correct.
And then you said those lymphomas we don't know the causes of except for very few cases where we identify specific mutations. Do you see that?
I do see that.
Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about Wendell. In Wendell, did you use the same methodology or a different one than you're using here?
Sure. Wendell case was over 10 years ago. I have very vague recollection of that case. But if I was looking at the causes of somebody's lymphoma, I would most likely would have used the same methodology as we've discussed today.
Okay, and in Wendell, you recall that the type of cancer that the plaintiff had was called hepatosplenic T-cell lymphoma, correct?
That is correct.
It's a very rare lymphoma, correct?
It is very rare lymphoma, yes.
You said that the chances of the plaintiff in that case developing that type of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma were 1 in 6 million. Do you recall that?
I don't recall anything I said in this case, but the chances of any particular person developing this type of lymphoma is about correct.
About 1 in 6 million.
Again, I would have to look at the calculations, but it is one of the rarest types of lymphomas. I don't want to say the numbers without confirming them, but it is a very rare type of lymphoma. Probably one of the
And diffuse large B-cell lymphoma is one of the most common, or the most common type of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, correct? Okay. Now, at the time of your deposition in that case, which was 2013, so it was 5 years ago, you had treated 7 cases of hepatosplenic T-cell lymphoma. Do you recall that?
Again, I do not recall the facts like this specifically, but that would be in the right range. These are extremely rare, and over my career, I've treated either single-digit number or at most 1,000 patients.
And that puts you, you've probably treated more of that type of cancer than 99% of oncologists in the country, right?
I would say so, yes.
And
hold on a second, we're going to check. Something just dropped in my knee. Okay, we're good to go.
okay, the allegation in that case was that 2 drugs, mercaptopurin, an immunosuppressant, and infliximab, a TNF antagonist, caused Mr. Wendel's HSTCL, correct?
That's what the case was about, yes.
And you, in fact, in your clinical practice, of the 7 patients that you had treated as of that case, had found that 2 of the 7 patients, that their HSTCL was caused by that exact combination of drugs, right?
Once again, you're asking me to recall on the spot something that happened 5-7 years ago. It might be correct.
Well, look.
I cannot.
Sorry, look at page 22 of the same deposition if you'd like to refresh your recollection. Page 22, line 20 through 23:3.
Okay.
And does that refresh your recollection that in your clinical practice, that 2 of the 7 patients that you had treated with that specific cancer, you had found that that was the cause of their cancer in your clinical practice?
Yeah, what I say is that that's what I stated in my deposition, that over 4,000 patients that I've treated over a decade, I can't just rely on my memory, but I would defer to what I said at the time, which, as you stated, was 5 years ago.
Okay. Well, you certainly were trying to testify accurately under oath at the deposition, correct?
That's what I'm trying to do. You're asking if you recall something that happened 5 or more years ago, and very, very rare cases out of 4,000 that I have seen.
Okay. But clearly,
That's what I said.
okay, that's what you said, and we'll move on. Okay, so I want to talk about your methodology here and clarify a few things, okay?
Here meaning in the current case?
Yes, in the current 3 cases, Mr. Hardiman, Ms. Stevick, and Mr. Gabayu.
Okay.
Okay, now you have portions of your report that discuss general causation. We just looked at some of them, for example, where you copied portions of Dr. Navhan's report, right? But you are not claiming to be an expert in epidemiology, right?
Not to the degree that I can look at or question anything that was reported by papers that I've seen.
So when you made your determination to rule in Roundup or glyphosate, it's fair to say that you assumed general causation based on your review of other experts in the litigation, right?
I based my assumption or the notion that glyphosate or Roundup is a risk factor based on expert reports, as I stated, Weisenberger and Cartier and Ritz. This was the major sources where I did not have any reason to question it, nor was I asked to dispute their reports. This was not a purpose of my report.
Right, you were asked to assume that Roundup can cause cancer and then you were given the specific task of determining whether you should rule out Roundup as a cause of any of the three plaintiffs, right?
That's correct.
Now, you talked about how you reviewed two of the studies, and I want to walk through that, okay?
Sure.
So the first study that you reviewed in determining exposure was the Mcduffie study, correct?
It's one of the studies that I recall reading, yeah.
Okay, well, if you look at your report, we can look at Ms. Stevick's report, which is tab 9. And if you turn to page 7 of that report, that's where you describe in the first bullet, the first little bullet, the Mcduffie study, correct?
Yes, I see that.
And that's where you obtain the 2 days per year that you discussed during your direct, right?
Yeah, this was, I recall it was between Mcduffie and Erickson, where I got 2 days per year and 10 days over lifetime. That's my recollection.
That's as far as you went? Is that what you said?
Yeah, so this is as far as I went, reviewing general causation literature, so I can expect specific supporting facts, so I can make my judgment on specific causation in the cases.
Now, you also cited an odds ratio for Mcduffie of 2.12. You understand that that's an unadjusted odds ratio. It's unadjusted for other pesticides, right?
I recall reading that I found only one paper, to my memory, without looking at the papers. I believe it's one of the Giroux papers where the pesticides were adjusted, and in other reports they were not adjusted.
So it's your recollection in the Mcduffie paper and the Erickson paper that there were no odds ratios reported when adjusted for pesticides?
Again, my recollection on the spot is that I recall one of the Giroux papers had adjustment for pesticides, and I did not go any further than that because I was not finding on general causation. I found at least one paper that did adjustment for pesticides, and for purposes of my specific causation, I felt it was sufficient.
Okay, you certainly didn't distinguish in any of these paragraphs on this page 7 whether the numbers were adjusted for pesticides or not when discussing Mcduffie, Giroux, in terms of which regression you were using, or the Erickson paper, correct?
I did not discuss many specifics because this was not the purpose of my report. So I did an exploratory reading of the general causation literature, so I can support matching facts from that literature to cases of the patient. My reliance on assuming or presuming that Roundup causes lymphoma was from general causation expert that I just mentioned.
Now, we see that Mcduffie is where you obtain the 2 days per year, right?
So between Mcduffie, I believe, and Erickson, that was 2 days per year and 10 days per lifetime. I can look at the papers, but between those, that's where I got my measurements for my scale. I can switch to match exposure by patient.
Right, and I don't need to belabor this, but in your report, you talk about 2 days per year in the Mcduffie paragraph and 10 days in their lifetime in the Erickson paragraph, right? Don't worry about it, Dr. Schustoff. We can read the report. But those two metrics, 2 days per year or 10 lifetime days, those became your floor for exposure, correct?
To match against the plaintiff's usage, that's correct.
So under your methodology, if someone used Roundup for at least 10 days total or 2 days per year, you ruled in Roundup as a possible cause of their NHL, correct?
No, I ruled Roundup as a possible cause of NHL based on general expert reports. What I was looking in general causation papers is the actual, at least some metrics, so I can compare specific exposure by plaintiffs. I did not rule Roundup as a causation based on that, rather by expert reports that I did question. I was not asked to.
That's a fair clarification. Let me ask it a different way. Once the plaintiffs met that floor, so once they had exposure that was above either 2 days per year or 10 lifetime days, then you did not rule out Roundup, right?
Not only I did not rule it out, it appeared to me that exposure in plaintiffs far exceeded that floor was.
Oh yeah, I said to the other court reporter that I or the lawyer will jump in and make them repeat if something that was inaudible is important. But other than that, I would say don't sweat it. Just mark that it was inaudible, since this is just a Daubert hearing. But I would like to ask a follow-up question of Dr. Schustoff, if I may, just to make sure I understand the testimony you've given on cross-examination. So I believe that you said, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, I'm just trying to make sure I understand it. I believe that you said that once you identify glyphosate as a risk factor, that means that it's more likely than not that the glyphosate was a substantial factor in causing NHL. Am I recalling that testimony correctly?
Yes, Your Honor, and as much as the plaintiff's exposure was matched against the what counsel called the floor, there was sufficient exposure. I did not question the fact that the Roundup is a risk factor.
Okay, I think so. What you're saying is you're not questioning whether Roundup is a risk factor. You're relying on the general causation experts for that, right?
That's correct.
And then you've established this floor for exposure, and are you saying that once a particular plaintiff exceeds that floor of exposure, then automatically for any plaintiff, it means that Roundup was a substantial factor in causing their non-Hodgkin's lymphoma?
Well, this is only one of the parameters I was looking at to create some scale, how I can match the patient with plaintiff exposure to the floor that was established to have significant risk factor for lymphoma.
Sorry, could you repeat that? Your sound went in and out, so I'm not sure I followed the response.
Sure. So for me to rule the Roundup as a substantial contributing factor, besides the fact that I accepted it as a general causation risk, one of the factors I would look at is whether the exposure in plaintiffs would exceed at least or match the exposure that's described in epidemiologic literature that demonstrated significant risk
Okay,
So that's what I.
Oh, I'm sorry. Just to understand your methodology, so but once you established that a plaintiff exceeded that floor, okay, is it then automatic, your conclusion that Roundup was a substantial factor in causing their NHL? Or is there any other analysis that needs to be conducted before you reach that conclusion?
No, Your Honor. I would not automatically call it substantial contributing factor because then I have to go through my differential diagnosis or deductive method and see what else patients were exposed to, or whether there are any other factors that I believe would be more significant than Roundup exposure. It would give me the floor to rule in the Roundup as one of the risk factors I would have then to interrogate with differential diagnosis technique and establish whether or not it was a substantial factor amongst other factors. As an example, I would say if the patient had substantial radiation exposure, or if the patient was found to have some hereditary syndrome that causes cancer in 80% of the children of those parents, it might or might not change my opinion whether Roundup was what a chemical was substantial contributing factor. But that floor that you're describing allowed me to rule in the Roundup into my list of factors that then I interrogated with my deductive method.
Okay, that clears it up for me. Thank you. Go ahead.
But isn't it, I mean, I just want to follow up on that, Dr. Schustoff, based on your prior testimony, because haven't you testified that if a patient, or isn't it true that if a patient had the minimal exposure under Erickson or Mcduffie, you would say that Roundup was a possible substantial factor in that patient's diagnosis?
So let me give you a specific example. So this is a question that kind of opens up a couple of possibilities. In particular plaintiff's case, it is, for me, was the minimum requirement that I would include Roundup exposure into the list of substantial contributing factors, and it would be unlikely that I would exclude them at the end of my deductive method. Now, if on a general level, if, say, somebody who was exposed to the Roundup at the minimum level and was diagnosed with lymphoma that is known to be 100% caused by a different virus, I would say that it's very likely that almost undeniable that virus caused the lymphoma because of undeniable association. And Roundup is less likely to cause this particularly unique type of lymphoma. But for most cases, when I included Roundup into the list of factors, it became a candidate for being substantial contributing factor.
Right, so in response to the judge, I think you gave two examples. I think you mentioned lifetime exposure to extensive lifetime exposure to radiation. That was one example you gave, right?
Correct.
And then the second example you gave was if someone had a hereditary gene that in 80% of cases led to someone's, the gene came from their parents, and in 80% of cases it led to the child developing non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. That was the second example you gave, correct?
Correct.
And those, we can agree that both of those circumstances are extremely rare, right?
Correct.
And so absent extremely rare circumstances like those, the answer to the judge's question is yes. If someone has the minimal exposure under the two studies we've discussed, you would automatically say that Roundup was was more likely than not a substantial contributing factor to his or her development of NHL, right?
Yeah, so if we assume that, or accept, not assume, if we accept that based on general causation, the Roundup is a risk factor for lymphoma, and the patient has the minimum requirement based on whatever limit of exposure we establish, it would be most likely one of the main contributing factors or the only substantial contributing factor if I rule out other candidates on the list.
So I'd like to shift a little bit and talk about some of the things that did not matter to your methodology. I think I'll go through it quickly because Ms. Wagstaff covered some of them. It didn't matter to your methodology whether glyphosate came in contact with any of the plaintiff's skin, correct?
It did not matter to my conclusion in the sense that I did not see any significant discussion in epidemiologic literature, so I did not really include this into forming my opinion.
Okay, and I'll accept that you didn't see this in the epidemiological literature, but just to move quickly, it didn't matter whether the plaintiffs showered after using Roundup, right?
Again, it might or might not matter in general causation kind of discussion or in a particular discussion, but in forming my opinion about this particular patient, I did not consider this a factor that allowed me to decide whether or not it was a substantial contributing factor.
Okay, same answer. That same thing is true as to whether the plaintiffs, the area that they were spraying the Roundup in terms of land, correct?
The area contributed to my decision insofar that it gave me a general idea of how much Roundup they were using on every time they would be treating their property, but it did not affect, again, my decision as far as specific causation.
Okay, same on what the type of Roundup the plaintiffs used, right?
I'm sorry, could you repeat this?
The same answer with respect to the type of Roundup that the plaintiffs used, right?
When I asked the patients what they used, and I think all of them specified that they used a super concentrate, I believe it's called, and beyond that, I did not question them on the specifics of the product.
Right, but it also did not matter to your methodology, right?
It did not matter into my decision for specific causation.
Okay.
I'm not saying it doesn't matter at all for other questions, but for making my conclusion, I did not include this as a...
Right, but we're here to talk about your conclusions, Dr. Schustoff, so that's what I'm trying to understand, okay? All right. I'll move on past Roundup use, but one other thing that didn't matter to your conclusion was whether you had any literature to support the specific types of NHL that the three plaintiffs had, correct?
The type of NHL that the plaintiffs had did not play into my conclusion about their causation.
So let's talk about these medical examinations that you testified about on your direct and just give some circumstances. First of all, those interviews and examinations took place in a hotel conference room, right? By the Seattle airport, right?
Actually close to my medical center.
Okay, we can agree that's not where you typically examine your patients, right?
No, it's not a typical place for examination.
And there was nothing in those physical examinations that occurred that indicated that Roundup was the cause of any of the plaintiff's NHL, right?
Yeah, physical examination would not be a test or method that would tell me what caused somebody's lymphoma.
Right, that was not the purpose of these medical examinations that occurred, correct?
The purpose of examination for me was to thoroughly evaluate the patient, including their history and physical findings. That's what I'm trained to do.
Okay, and then when you took their medical history, you relied on that medical history over their medical records, correct?
I rely on both of those sources of information equally. Having said that, I never question patients' answer to my questions when I ask them about medical or social history, because I do know as a physician, sometimes the transcribed records do have errors or typos, or the information just gets transferred from one record to another without verifying it for a prolonged period of time with the patient. So it would not be completely unheard of when I talk to patients in my clinic to verify that what I saw in the medical records was not correct, and I would make corrections to their medical records to set the record straight.
Right, so I just want to be... In this case, when you met with the three plaintiffs, if there was a dispute between what they told you and the medical records, you relied on what they told you as opposed to the contemporaneous medical records that were written by their treating physicians.
It depends on the type of information that I'm considering. Say, if the medical information is talking about the results of the CT scan, I would rely on the report of the CT scan and radiology. If I'm considering information of patients' smoking history or, say, alcohol use, or in this case, Roundup use, I would rely on what patients are telling me, because information from medical records would use the same source, the patients, and sometimes providers or people who collect that information, which in many cases are not physicians, but maybe physician assistant nurses, sometimes transcribed incorrectly. So for those kind of information, I would rely on what patients are telling me. I have no reason to classification.
Okay, so before we talk about hepatitis C, I just want to clarify, sort of following up on what Judge Chhabria asked you, what your opinion is. First of all, you agree that in any particular patient, nobody can determine what exactly caused his or her lymphoma, right?
In the majority of cases of lymphoma, it would be very hard to determine specific cause short of having specific tests that tells us what caused it.
So now for all three of these plaintiffs, for all the reasons we've discussed, what your opinion is that glyphosate substantially contributed or might have caused the lymphomas, right?
That's correct.
You are simply saying that because Roundup or glyphosate increases one's risk of developing lymphoma, it is a possible substantial factor, correct?
It's one of the reasons. But the whole point of my report is to go through my, but methodology of looking at other possible factors, and also looking at discuss limits of exposure, and asking patients how they use it, how much they use it, to match against those limits, and taking the if you gave me a hypothetical patient and said, okay, this patient was exposed to Roundup, is it the significant factor in their lymphoma? I would say I would have to talk to the patient and do a thorough evaluation of medical records, and then I can grant my opinion. So, and that's what I did in this case.
Right, and then you determined that Roundup was a possible substantial factor in all three plaintiffs' cases, correct?
It is my opinion it's more likely than not a substantial contributing factor based on everything we discussed today. The level of the exposure and looking at other possible
Okay, and that would be the case for anyone who had sufficient exposure to Roundup, right?
For anybody with sufficient exposure, I would have to do, again, the same type of analysis or method. I have to look at everything we discussed today in this plaintiff's cases, their family history and other immune disease, other exposures, et cetera, before I would grant a final opinion. But to answer your question, it's not automatic. I would have to study this particular patient.
Well, Dr. Shustov, look in the deposition transcript binder. Look at tab 1, which is your deposition in the Hardiman case, okay? Page.
I need to switch binder 1 second.
And I'm looking at page 217, line 18.
Page 217, line 18.
And you were asked, I'm asking you, that's exactly what I'm asking you. If somebody is sufficiently exposed, is Roundup a substantial contributing factor? And there was an objection, and then your answer was, if you pose the question directly in a similar situation, anybody who is substantially exposed, I would state the same. I would make the same statement, that in this particular patient who had sufficient or substantial exposure based on general causation literature, that Roundup has increased the risk of lymphoma. Do you see that?
I see that. But you just stated that, you just read my statement, that in a similar situation, and in a similar situation where I had the chance of examining the patient, make the same list of risk factors and do my analysis. That's what similar situation.
Well, look at page 218, Dr. Shustov, line 15, because the discussion goes on. Do you see that?
So line 15, page 218. Okay, I'm here.
And you were asked, and that would be the case for anyone who had sufficient exposure to Roundup. And your answer was, for anybody who had sufficient exposure to Roundup, based on the published literature, answer is yes. It will be a substantial contributing factor. That was your answer, right?
Well, we're having the same line of discussion where I stated just prior that in a similar situation, I think that it carries over to what I just said.
Okay, now let's turn to your rule out process. The lack of epidemiological expertise applies to other, or what your status as an epidemiologist or not applies to other risk factors as well, correct?
In terms of general causation, I would agree with you.
You didn't have reports from people like, or experts like Dr. Ritz and Dr. Weisenberger and Dr. Portier about, for example, hepatitis C, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so if we look in your report about Mr. Hardiman, which you have from Ms. Wagstaff, but also if you look in the exhibits binder, it's exhibit number 1, tab number 1.
Before we go on, Mr. Sokoloff, can I ask about how much time you have left?
My plan is just basically to cover hepatitis C, which I'm hoping I can do in less than 30 minutes, and then I think we're very close to done after that. Yeah, there are some studies that I may need to show. I'm happy to just submit them to the court, but I think that's one of the issues with the hepatitis C.
Why don't we take a 10-minute break, and we'll resume at 5 o'clock, and I will give you 15 more minutes.
Okay. Okay.